The wooden gate creaked in the autumn wind as Thomas Crawford stood at the edge of the property, his hat clutched in work-worn hands. The ranch before him was smaller than he'd expected. A modest house with peeling paint, a barn that leaned slightly to the left, and fences that desperately needed mending. But it was the flower garden by the front porch that caught his attention. A riot of late-season blooms that someone had tended with care despite everything else falling into disrepair. Thomas was 38 years old, tall and lean from years of hard work, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of storm clouds. He'd spent the last 15 years working other men's ranches, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. Some called him a drifter, though he preferred to think of himself as a man still searching for where he belonged. His own small ranch in Wyoming had failed 3 years ago, a combination of bad weather, worse luck, and the fact that working land alone was a battle he'd been losing long before the bank took it from him. He'd heard about the widow Carter from old Pete Harrison at the lumber yard in town. Pete had mentioned, almost casually, that Catherine Carter was looking for a ranch hand, someone who knew cattle and wasn't afraid of hard work. Her husband had died 8 months prior, leaving her with a struggling ranch, 2 young children, and debts that were piling up faster than she could manage. Most men in town had offered their help in ways that came with expectations Catherine wasn't willing to meet, so she'd stopped asking and started failing slowly, with dignity. Thomas had almost talked himself out of coming here a dozen times during the 10-mile ride from town. What did he have to offer besides a strong back and broken dreams? But something in Pete's description of the widow, proud, determined, refusing charity but drowning slowly, had resonated with something deep in his chest. Maybe it was recognition. Maybe it was just loneliness calling to loneliness. He forced himself to walk up the path, past the flower garden that spoke of hope and stubbornness, and raised his hand to knock on the weathered door. 3 firm raps, then he stepped back and waited, his heart beating harder than it should for a simple job inquiry. The door opened, and Thomas found himself looking at Catherine Carter. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 30, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that held both wariness and exhaustion. She wore a simple cotton dress covered by an apron, and there was a smudge of flour on her cheek that she'd missed. She was pretty, he realized with a start, though it was a worn prettiness, like a flower still blooming despite a hard frost. "Mrs. Carter?" His voice came out rougher than intended. "My name's Thomas Crawford. I was told in town that you might need a rancher. Someone who knows cattle and can handle the work." Catherine's expression didn't change, but he saw her hands tighten slightly on the doorframe. "Who told you that?"
Pete Harrison, Mom.
"At the lumber yard. He mentioned you were managing on your own and Mike could use some help." A flash of something, embarrassment, perhaps, or anger at Pete for speaking of her situation, crossed her face. "I appreciate you coming out, Mr. Crawford, but I'm not in a position to pay ranch hand wages right now. Perhaps later in the season." "I wasn't asking for wages, ma'am." The words came out before Thomas had fully thought them through, but once spoken, he realized they were true. "I was thinking more of a trade. You've got land that needs working, and I've got time and know-how. Room and board would be sufficient, and maybe a small share when the cattle sell, if there's anything to share." Catherine stared at him as if he'd spoken a foreign language. "That's not a fair trade, Mr. Crawford. You'd be working for almost nothing." "Fair is relative, ma'am. Right now, I've got no place particular to be and no work lined up for winter. A warm place to sleep and regular meals is more than nothing." He met her eyes steadily, trying to convey that this wasn't pity, even if he wasn't entirely sure what it was. She studied him for a long moment, and Thomas felt as if she were looking past his weathered exterior to something deeper. He'd heard that widows developed a sixth sense about men's intentions, born from necessity and hard experience. Whatever she saw in him must have been acceptable, because she finally nodded slowly. "There's a bunkhouse behind the barn. It's not much, but it's weatherproof. I can offer 3 meals a day and coffee when you need it. The work is hard. I won't pretend otherwise. The ranch is barely holding on, Mr. Crawford. My husband, God rest him, was sick for 2 years before he passed. Things got away from us. Most things can be fixed with time and effort, ma'am." "And some things can't," she said quietly, but she stepped back from the door. "Would you like to see the property?" Thomas followed her around the ranch, and with each step, his heart sank a little further. It was worse than he'd expected. The fences were in terrible shape, several outbuildings needed serious repair, and the small herd of cattle he could see in the distance looked thin and scattered. The irrigation system was failing, and the hay barn was half empty with winter approaching. This wasn't a ranch that needed a hired hand. It was a ranch that needed a miracle. But he also noticed other things. He noticed how Catherine pointed out each problem with clear-eyed honesty, not hiding the extent of the damage. He noticed the neat vegetable garden that would help feed them through winter, the carefully maintained chicken coop, the way she'd prioritized what she could manage alone. He noticed the two children watching from the house window, a boy of perhaps 8 and a girl a few years younger, their faces pressed against the glass with curiosity and something that might have been hope. "It's a lot of work," Catherine said when they'd completed the circuit, her voice carefully neutral. "More than one man can handle while keeping up with regular ranch duties. I understand if you want to reconsider your offer." Thomas looked at the land spread before them, golden in the afternoon light despite its obvious struggles. He thought about his own failed ranch, about the years of drifting from one temporary job to another, about the bone-deep loneliness that had become his constant companion. He thought about the widow who had tended her flower garden even while everything else fell apart, and the children watching from the window, and the way Catherine had described her problems without either exaggeration or false hope. "I'd like to stay, ma'am. If you'll have me." Something flickered in Catherine's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or relief, or maybe just exhaustion finally finding a place to rest. "Then I suppose we have an arrangement, Mr. Crawford. You can move into the bunkhouse whenever you're ready." Thomas moved in that evening, his few possessions taking up barely a corner of the small but clean bunkhouse. Catherine brought him dinner on a tray, beef stew and fresh bread with butter, and he saw her eyes take in how little he owned. A bedroll, a change of clothes, some basic tools, and a worn Bible his mother had given him 20 years ago. It was the sum total of his life, and it looked even more meager laid out in the lamplight. "Thank you for the meal, ma'am," he said, and she nodded and left without another word. The work began before dawn the next morning. Thomas started with the fences, knowing that without proper boundaries, the cattle would wander and what little herd remained would be lost. He worked through the morning chill, his muscles remembering the rhythm of ranch work even after months away from it. Catherine appeared around mid-morning with coffee and biscuits, setting them on a fence post without speaking before returning to the house. It became their pattern over the following weeks. Thomas would work from dawn until dark, tackling the most critical repairs first. Catherine would bring him coffee in the morning and again in the afternoon, and they would exchange perhaps a dozen words about what needed doing next. She fed him well, better than he'd eaten in years, and he noticed that she and the children often ate simpler fare than what she brought him. It bothered him, but he didn't know how to address it without offending her pride. The children were curious about him. The boy, David, would sometimes watch him work from a distance, and the girl, Lucy, would peek around corners when he came to the house. He made no move to approach them, sensing that Catherine was protective and that trust would have to be earned slowly. It was 3 weeks into his stay when the first real conversation happened. Thomas had been working on the barn roof, replacing rotted shingles, when a sudden storm rolled in. He climbed down quickly, but not quickly enough to avoid getting soaked. Catherine appeared at the barn door just as he was wringing water from his shirt. "Come to the house," she called over the sound of the rain. "You'll catch your death out here." He followed her to the house, where she pointed him to a chair by the wood stove and handed him a towel. The children watched from the kitchen table where they'd been doing lessons, their eyes wide at seeing the stranger in their house. "David, Lucy, this is Mr. Crawford. He's been helping us with the ranch." Catherine's voice was gentle when she spoke to them, a different tone than the carefully neutral one she used with Thomas. "Mr. Crawford, these are my children." "Pleased to meet you both," Thomas said, and David nodded seriously while Lucy half hid behind her brother. Catherine poured coffee and, perhaps because the storm had forced proximity or perhaps because she was simply tired of silence, she began to talk. She told him about her husband, Robert, who had been a good man but not a particularly successful rancher. About how the illness had drained their savings long before it took his life. About the debts to the bank and the feed store, about the neighbors who had offered help that came with strings attached, about her determination to keep the ranch for her children even as it slipped through her fingers. Thomas listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said quietly, "You're doing the best you can with what you've got. That takes more strength than most people ever need to find." Catherine looked at him then, really looked at him, and something in her expression shifted. "Why are you really here, Mr. Crawford? And don't tell me it's just about room and board. You could find that anywhere with your skills." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, listening to the rain drum on the roof. "I had my own place once," he finally said. "In Wyoming. Lost it 3 years ago. Been drifting since then, working other people's land, never staying long enough to care too much when it was time to move on. But you get tired, you know? Tired of not belonging anywhere. Tired of being alone." He looked up and met her eyes. "When Pete told me about your situation, something in it felt familiar. Maybe I thought if I could help save your ranch, it would feel a little like saving my own. Or maybe I'm just tired of drifting and this seemed like a place worth staying." The honesty hung between them, raw and undefended. Catherine stared at him, and he saw tears gather in her eyes before she blinked them away. "We're quite a pair," she said softly. "Both trying to hold on to something that maybe is already lost." "Or maybe not," Thomas said. "I've been looking at the numbers, ma'am. With your permission, I'd like to see your books. I think if we're smart about it, if we make it through this winter, we might have a fighting chance come spring." That night marked a turning point. Catherine showed him the ranch accounts, and they sat at the kitchen table long after the children had gone to bed, going over figures by lamplight. The situation was dire but not hopeless. Thomas proposed selling off some of the weaker cattle now to buy feed for the stronger ones, making strategic repairs that would prevent bigger problems, and focusing their limited resources on what would get them through to spring when they could rebuild. As the weeks turned into months, the ranch slowly began to stabilize. Thomas worked harder than he'd ever worked in his life, and Catherine worked alongside him when she could, leaving the children with a neighbor. He taught David how to mend fences, and Lucy began leaving him small gifts, a smooth stone, a drawing of a horse, a perfectly shaped pine cone, that he kept on the shelf in the bunkhouse like treasures. And slowly, carefully, Thomas and Catherine began to talk. Real conversations, not just about ranch business but about life, about dreams, about the weight of loss and the stubborn persistence of hope. He learned that she loved books but rarely had time to read them, that she missed music, that she'd wanted to see the ocean but had never traveled more than 50 miles from where she was born. She learned that he'd wanted to be a teacher once, that he played harmonica but hadn't touched it in years, that he'd been alone so long he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be part of something. It was during a cold evening in late November when everything changed. Thomas had been playing his harmonica. Catherine had asked him to, had almost begged, saying she needed to hear music, and the children were dancing in the firelight. Catherine sat in her chair, watching them with a smile that transformed her face, making her look young and unguarded. When the song ended and the children collapsed in giggles, she looked over at Thomas, and the expression on her face stole his breath. "Thank you," she said softly. "For all of this. For staying. For caring about this place and these children. For caring about me." Thomas set down his harmonica with careful deliberation.
MRS Carter, Catherine, I need to tell you something.
"I came here thinking I was just looking for a place to work, a place to rest for a while. But somewhere along the way, this stopped being just a job. This ranch, your children, you've become important to me. More important than I've let anything be in a very long time." Catherine's breath caught, and tears spilled over onto her cheeks. "I'm so tired of being alone," she whispered.
So tired of being strong all by myself.
"When you're here, I feel like I can breathe again. Like maybe we can actually make this work." Thomas crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking her work-roughened hands in his. "I'm not going anywhere, Catherine. Not unless you tell me to. This place, these children, you're my home now. If you'll have me, not just as a ranch hand but as someone who stays, someone who builds a life here with you, then I'm yours." She cupped his face in her hands, seeing him fully perhaps for the first time, seeing not just the lonely rancher who had knocked on her door, but the man with a good heart who had chosen to stay, who had worked without complaint, who had been patient and kind with her children, who had looked at her struggling ranch and seen not failure but possibility. "I see your heart, Thomas Crawford," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "I've been seeing it all along. And yes, I want you to stay. I want you to build a life here with us." When Thomas kissed her, it felt like coming home after years of wandering, like finding water after crossing a desert, like the first warm day after an endless winter. The children, understanding in the way children do, came and wrapped their arms around both of them, and they stood there in a circle by the fire, for people who had been lonely and lost finding in each other something precious and true. The ranch was saved that winter, but that wasn't really the miracle. The miracle was 4 broken pieces finding a way to become whole together, was loneliness transforming into belonging, was a lonely rancher and a struggling widow discovering that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is open your heart and let someone see all the way to the center of it. Spring came eventually, as it always does, and with it came new calves, new growth, and new hope. But the real transformation had already happened on that autumn day when Thomas Crawford had knocked on a weathered door and Catherine Carter had seen past the lonely rancher to the man with a good heart who was brave enough to stay.